All right, are you guys ready for non-reference content? Actually, I have 3 more sections to go. We'll see how much. We have about an hour and a half-ish. You guys seem like you'd be awesome colleagues, by the way. Like, it would be pretty neat to work with all of you. And there's a lot of, anyway, good talent and experience here.
That's not just so you get a good view.
No, honestly, I only have 1 colleague right now. It's really sad. Like, I work at a giant company and 1 other colleague. We're trying.
I'm sure I can make something.
No.
Building an API dark team soon.
Yeah.
The way it's growing.
I am the manager over API documentation.
All right, let's get into non-reference. We've spent a lot of time talking about reference docs, right? And we poured through the Swagger, the Open API. But the reference docs aren't the whole of API docs. In fact, they're probably only like a third or half of what people need to know. There's also this whole other part that I've sort of labeled non-reference, even though that's sort of defining something by what it's not. Some people call this a user guides, but here are the topics in this. The overview, the getting started, authentication and authorization, status and error codes, rate limiting and thresholds, code samples and tutorials, SDKs and sample apps, quick reference, and best practices and so forth in the Glossary. So we're going to jump through each of these pretty quickly. But these are also, like if you're checking boxes on what good API docs have, they have pretty much all of these components. They should, at least. All right, so the overview. The overview is the high-level introduction of what the API is all about. Too often, developers just assume that people know what their API is for, why somebody would use it, when in reality, this big picture is often lost. What is the API? What does it do? Who is it for? And why would I use this? Right? Very basic, simple questions, but you'd be amazed how many API doc sites don't have this. It's like that one we were exploring on the open source, you know, the data for Kandapar or whatever project. It was like, what is this API? Who is it? What does it do? Who is it for? That was not defined, right? So it was like developers are so immune to that because they're close to the code. They've been working on it. They can't really conceive that somebody would want to know why they would use it. Here's a quote from Treehouse Logic on the top 20 reasons why startups fail. Startups fail when they are not solving a market problem. We were not solving a large enough problem that we could universally serve with a scalable solution. We had great technology, great data, great reputation as a thought leader, great expertise, great advisors, etc. But what we didn't have was technology or business model that solved a pain point in a scalable way. So if you look at why do APIs fail? You know, people came out with a cool API, they were all excited, and then it failed. Well, it's because it didn't address a pain point in the market in a way that was, you know, scalable. It wasn't. it didn't solve a problem. So, and this is probably higher level than, you know, what you get into in the docs. But basically, the overview page should have some kind of sense of addressing the pain point that the API solves. Why would people want to use it? And if you find that it doesn't solve a market problem, then the API might not be used. So here's an example from SendGrid again. SendGrid, what is SendGrid? Who is SendGrid for? You know, very, very basic stuff. And even when they mention an SMTP server, they link out to that. They don't just assume that people know what this is. Basically, it's a way to send a bunch of email without having to maintain their own email servers. And then who's it for? Is it for me? Well, if you have a need to send a bunch of marketing emails, then it's probably for you. So that is the overview. Here's another example from Lyft. You know, everybody knows Lyft. It's how we get around, right? But oh, they've got an API? What the heck is that? So they start out pretty basic. What is Lyft? It's ride sharing, but why use Lyft as a developer? Well, you might, I actually don't even know, to be honest. I'd have to read more of that. I was just in Lyft yesterday. Have you ever had the same driver 2 rides in a row? I think you win a prize for that. I had that last night. It was like pretty exciting.
Were you stalking me?
What? Oh, we're stalking? No, he's like, no. After I drop people off, I just wait in that location for my next ride. So it kind of made sense, even though there was an hour and a half in between. All right. Next example, Watson Assistant. So here this is their about page. It's like, this is IBM Watson, this is how it works, and they have this high-level overview. So yeah, just some basic information. This is not rocket science, but this API overview is part of the API doc set. All right, second big component, getting started. Very common in the programming world, you have this time to hello world kind of concept, which is how fast can I make the very minimal output using this tool or this language. And APIs don't necessarily have hello world tutorials where you suddenly say hello world in, I don't know, Java or something. But they have, like, what's the complete number of steps I need to make the most basic call? Like, I have to get my authorization keys, and then I have to form my request, and then I have to send it, and then I have to configure, or, what is it that needs to be done? Here's an example. Well, actually, Run in Postman has this feature where they have this little button that has Run in Postman. You click that button. This one is actually clickable, and it will launch like Postman, and it'll populate it with all your requests. So in this thing called the Postman API network, all these different companies have these getting started tutorials that incorporate the Run in Postman button as a way to get people up and running, so that you don't have to go through and say, oh, you've got to configure your header parameters and your API keys and do this and that. It's like, no, here's how you get started. Click this button. Now you've populated Postman with all of our endpoints and everything. Just click that one and watch it go. It's really quite cool. If you go to this site, just search for Postman API Network at some point. You can see all these different companies have incorporated this. So if I go to PayPal, their getting started tutorial says download Postman. It actually has you enter this stuff, even though you can populate it through that button. But it's a great way to have people make a request in a very simple way. You need some kind of client to make the request. You could use curl, but hey, this is much easier. Anyway, I think that's pretty cool. There's a lot of examples of this too.
So are you saying that the getting started portion of the non-reference user guide or whatever it is should include some guidance about running in Postman? Or
It could. As a simple way to have them make a request, you could do this. I mean, obviously, it's not like some standard to use Postman for this, but it's one way. You need some kind of way to help people, I don't know, get started with something. Here's an example that's not Postman related. This is parse. Getting started. They probably run into this a lot. You cannot run the samples in this guide as is. It's like, anyway, they're pretty adamant about that. But basically, hey, you gotta figure out how you're gonna authenticate. Remember when we ran through the earlier parts of the course, you had to get your API key. That was one of your first things. In this case, they have an OAuth workflow, so it's like a little different. They're explaining this. Now here's making a request, and they're giving you the high level. They're like, this is your URL, high level stuff. So let's see, I think I have another example. PayPal. I was just showing that one. Some kind of getting started. This one includes the requests, responses, placing your first call. Let's go to that real quick. And things, oh yeah, make your first call. So they have the steps: create an app, get an access token, make REST calls. People like this kind of 1, 2, 3 business. You could even make like a quick reference guide or getting started handout or something out of this. Here's an example with Lyft. They also have a getting started, section. So this is common. I'm identifying common patterns. I think getting started is probably common in a lot of different things, right? But it is definitely common in API docs, in part because you have all these separate little pieces of info that you need with the authorization and the other app setup that might be required. Google has some as well. Okay. Authorization and authentication. Essentially, authentication asks, are you who you say you are? And authorization asks, are you allowed to do this action? And this is one of the essential sections in your documentation, because without this, people can't make a request. In the open weather map, it was really simple because you just registered for an API key and then it worked after 2 hours or it didn't work. But there are multiple sort of methods of authorization, and I'll cover them. I've actually made diagrams trying to explain them. This first one is just sort of simple. You have some key that travels along with the request, and if it matches a valid key at the server, then your request is granted and you get a response, right? No big deal. HMAC is another process. And I always forget what it stands for, and people Google it and then they tell me like 2 seconds later, hashed something, authentication, something. Essentially, here's what it is. And I use this when I worked at a company that, they did something more along the lines with like banking, because it's supposed to be a little more secure, I believe. It uses a key that's known only to like the client, the person making the request, and the server, but it's like constructed algorithmically so that you have to know these two components in order to validate it. You've got a message and a key that creates a signature. All right. This travels along here. The resource has an awareness of the message and key too, and then it decodes it into a signature that then encrypts it. Now, you don't have to know any of this, but this is just, this would not be something you document. You would explain to the person how they get the key and how they do this, and you might say use this HMAC, but it's not as if you're going to have to explain authentication to them. Just like what is required in order to get the key and how do you pass it. Another one called OAuth. This uses like a centralized server in order to manage the whole authentication. A centralized server that's separate from your server. So in this workflow, here we go. Here's your app. And first, it decides to make a request to this authentication service. And it says, yep, we're authenticated. This is any Facebook or Twitter or Google login. It sends back an access token. And then it makes a request to the server using this access token that then is sort of verified. So it's a whole separate service. Some people, my daughter tells me that the only reason Facebook is useful anymore is because it's an easy way to authenticate into different sites, right? So you have these OAuth kind of identity services that let you validate. This is really common in public APIs that are a little more robust. So in your documentation, you would have a section on API keys or whatever it is. You walk somebody through it. That's SendGrid. Here's an example from Twitter. Authorizing a request. This is your core documentation in your API that explains how you get authenticated. Here's from AWS. I was looking for an HMAC example. And yeah, I don't know why it's using HMAC in this example, but product advertising, for some reason, decided to use that. Why a developer chooses the authentication method they do, it sort of depends a little bit on the industry and how secure it needs to be and other considerations that are kind of beyond me, actually. So Dropbox uses OAuth. Does anybody have any insight? Why would somebody use OAuth instead of an API keys, or advantages that they're trying to tap into? OAuth is a lot more complex, at least behind the scenes. But I think maybe if you have a service where it's easy for developers to authenticate with some other guide online, maybe it makes more sense. Okay. Status and error codes. These are also really important to document. We touched upon this earlier in the responses section. But because status and error codes are kind of general across your API and not always specific to each endpoint, I recommend just having a page in your docs that says status and error codes that sort of relates to all your endpoints. If you have an endpoint that gives you a special error code unique to that endpoint, then it would make sense to include it with that endpoint's documentation. But if it's not, then it doesn't really merit that. The basic guide is that people get error codes and they should help troubleshoot the reason they got the error, right? They should help users recover from this failure. So if you have a bunch of things like, oh, this is a 403, 500, if you can provide in your documentation some kind of like suggested resolution steps, that is the best practice. I showed this response header. This is if you want to see the error code, it comes back in the response. You can see this in Postman as well. There's a section where you can see the header. But that little code up there at the top is where you'll see this status code in a curl command. Here's an example from context.io where it goes through and it's like, these are the different error codes. And it provides some explanation like 402, payment required, you exceeded your user limit. You know, something is actually helpful. Even forbidden, you're passing a resource ID for the wrong version of the API. You know, not so helpful on the 404, but things are more descriptive than just like something's wrong. Even the bad request, you're probably using a wrong parameter and or passing in incorrect data, you know, something like that. Twitter also gives really good explanations of their codes, of the requests, and why they got the error and how do you recover from it. And as I believe one of you was pointing out, this information isn't usually provided by the developer. You have to go and hunt this down. You might purposely try to put in bad parameters to prompt error codes in the response, and then use those codes to say, developers, what's going on here? I don't know why, but like trying to ask a developer, what are all the conditions whereupon you would receive an error code is usually beyond what they will do. Like you could probably get a 400 for like 20 different problems, right? So they will most likely want to stick with general stuff, but the more specific you can get, the better. So try to break the API and see what comes back, and then try to document those. It's fun to do that too, right? Especially if like you expose a bug or like you do something and it really does break it.
So maybe it's better to have, instead of having a separate section for error codes on the left, maybe it's better to integrate it with the resource, because let's say a 404 is, you get that. Why is it, and what did you do with that particular resource?
Yeah, it could be. If it's resource specific, sure. And some docs prefer to just include it on every one. You've got it as a central object somewhere in your docs and you just embed it on each one. You can do that. The only problem is that it's kind of long. So this Twitter one, like if you embedded this on every resource page, it gets to be a little heavy, right? It's like there's a lot of stuff here. And they've got a lot of error codes that are very unique. And darn it, I'm really mad they've removed the 421, but whatever. If you were to embed this on every endpoint, it might make your docs look. You did see it?
I didn't see it. It's on the other page.
Enhance your calm. When an app is being rate limited for making too many requests. I wonder if that's real or if that's just a joke. Anyway, you want to keep your docs somewhat simple looking, so it depends on what your preferences are there. But yeah, you could totally do that. Yeah, in the back.
Terminology for, this example is calling them response codes. I think your terms here are status and error codes, and then what they're really listing is like troubleshooting, right? Like what to do when you get these status or error codes.
I mean, the troubleshooting is related. I wouldn't say that this is specifically troubleshooting. It's like and yeah, even here, this Twitter example, the general term, I guess, is response codes, but the status code is like the HTTP status code. Maybe there's other codes. But yeah,
but the reader audience for API documentation is gonna think of, they're gonna look for status codes or error codes.
Yeah. All those would be acceptable. And they should be familiar with the concept of these codes, because it's just like the way of abbreviating the error. Very common. What was I going to say? Yeah, anyway. Here's an example from MailChimp. They also have really good troubleshooting information. If you look, like 400 bad requests, it's not just saying you messed up. It's like, these are the possible things you did wrong. Maybe you had a JSON parse error. Maybe you had an invalid resource. Maybe you're trying to do an invalid action. This is the kind of documentation that goes beyond like basic expectations and would be considered, good, helpful docs. Okay. Rate limiting and thresholds. This is another topic that you definitely want to include in your non-reference. For example, with the Open Weather Map API, we found that when we had a room full of people hitting it, like it was erroring out. Could have been that some of the API keys were new, but it could have been that their rate limiting was kicking in, making too many simultaneous requests. And on the free plan, we don't support that. This kind of information, because developers need to know what happens if I get this huge spike and I'm making tons of requests. Do you just freeze up, or do you stop working, or do you hang? Do you not return information, and then you need to implement error handling to handle that, right? Because I at the gamification company I worked at, there was this time where this operations guy was going nuts because there was this developer who had implemented the API request so that it was pinging constantly, like he did it wrong for some reason. And it was creating this huge spike of calls. It's like, whoa, it's crashing our servers. So this guy just turned it off. He basically looked for that API key and made it invalid so that it cut it off. But now the developer who implemented that, their site was broken. So this kind of information is important to know how many times you can make requests to the server and get back information.
This is again one of the things that the testing team will be most
Yeah.
likely to give you, because they're
Yeah.
the first one
Definitely. Your testing team is like your best friends by far. They should have test cases so that you know what kind of calls are supposed to be made, what is supposed to be returned, and they should have all that defined. It should be a gold mine for jump-starting the documentation. They're usually much more friendly. They don't have the alpha ego personalities that some developers might have. They're there to help. Okay.
It depends on you as well, the writer.
Yeah.
Because once you've polished everything, then they consume it. So
Yeah, so you can give and take. Here's an example from GitHub on their rate limiting documentation. They basically talk about how many requests you're allowed to make, what's the limit, and in the header, they'll actually tell you, you've got 56 requests remaining or something. So this is where header information could be helpful. LinkedIn has another example, hey, here's request throttling, right? This is probably another familiar term, throttling. Nobody likes to be throttled. And explains a little bit about what triggers that. When you're at home and suddenly your Wi-Fi is really slow, there's a suspicion that you're being throttled. It's not fun. And one final example with Bitly. again, just defining this. It doesn't have to be extensive. This is like 200 words here. But this should be something that you cover. All right, code samples and tutorials. Now this is where it gets harder, right? If you have, let's say you wanted to explain to a developer how he or she makes a call in combination with another as part of like a language-specific sequence, well then you get into this world of code samples and tutorials. And this is also really important. Usually you find 1 or 2 examples in documentation that kind of get people started. Basically, in any kind of code that you document, when you're documenting a code sample, you want to focus on the why more than the what. The presumption is that people are familiar with the mechanics of code because they're developers working in that code, but they may not really understand why you're choosing to do things a certain way. So if you just keep that in mind, it will help you go a long way. Here's a quote from 6 Pillars of Complete Developer Documentation. It says, while a developer's guide should walk a developer through the basic usage of an API and its functionality, it can't cover every possible use of an API in a coherent way. That is where articles and tutorials come in, to teach developers tangential or specialized uses of an API, like combining it with another service, framework, or API. So yeah, there's this common sentiment you might run into with developers who think that they've generated this open API document or they've done the reference documentation and that's all you need. And that's all they're willing to give you. But documentation, as you know, is so much more, right? It's like you need these tutorials that walk you through the scenario from end to end, or just like more comprehensive information. Do you use these endpoints in certain sequences, or like are there things to set up before you can even make a call? And what do you do with the information? How do you make sense of it? And you're going to have to write some tutorial content. Usually developers will expect the technical writer to create these tutorials and the articles that are the user guide content. Any comments or thoughts on that? All right. Twilio, they have this is a video. If you search online, you'll find this. They found that, and they're a model example of good documentation, by the way. They found that in their tutorials, when they put the code up front first, they had much better readership of the stuff. People, like, it performed better. People were on the page longer, more usage of it. So this little thing says if the sentences on the page, if there's a bunch of sentences before your code example, then your readership starts, like, people jump off the page sooner. Whereas if you start out with a big code higher up, then people stay on the page longer. So this is kind of an interesting idea, right? It's like, but yeah, when you're writing your tutorials, throw in code samples, stick them up high, front and center, because that's really the language that people understand. Remember, code is in another language, just like Spanish or Portuguese or something. And when people who speak that language see it, it like communicates so much more to them. So if you can foreground that code, Twilio says people will pay attention more on the page. Developers really like code samples, especially code samples that are workable, that you can copy and paste and that work. So here are a few principles. Don't just provide the reference docs, right? Go beyond that. Focus on the why. Keep the code samples really simple. The simpler the better. Be able to copy and paste them, and try to provide one in a target language that your users might use. But hands down, this is like the most complex part, right? When you're trying to articulate the code and provide workable samples and explain it. It's like you might just have to rely on engineers to kind of provide some of this, or interview them and talk them through it, check it with others.
How's the tutorial different from the getting started or time?
It could be similar. It could be part of it. Usually you might have a tutorial on different scenarios. But yeah, getting started is one type of tutorial. I think that getting started tries to be as simple as possible, whereas another tutorial might be more complex. I have some examples here. This is from another weather API. Now here they provide code samples in other languages, but they don't actually have any comments on them. So my guess is that either the developer said, oh, anybody who knows PHP is going to understand exactly what this is doing, and the writer was like, oh, okay. Or the developer just was like, I'm throwing this code here and people will understand it. So at least, hats off that they have various code samples, but it's so much more than that, right? Here's an example from Eventful that gives a whole tutorial on using search. So while they have a search endpoint, they also have a bunch of explanation. Here are the basics, and here's some sample requests, and walks people through it. I point this out because this is information that presumably exists within the search endpoint and the parameters, but you need a tutorial to really help users understand what's going on. And here's the Twilio one. This one is quite impressive, so I would like to show this. At some point I'd like to figure out technically how they do it, but let's say you have a voice quick start. Well, first of all, you've got some nice selectors on the left that can narrow things down through a filter, and conveniently you have it in every language you want, right? So let's say that I want this in Java. Well, they've got it in Java. Now, once I get to the bottom of one, it kind of expands into the next section. And you can they can see how far a user gets, but they've got a nice walkthrough here. At some point, one of these places, they have another pane that shows the code, and it comes into focus on certain steps. I'm not really finding those right now, but you can see it's nice. It's narrative. It walks you through this. It's got it's chunked up. It's got lots of code samples and screenshots and so forth. And it's all broken out by language. This kind of documentation is sort of rare, and I don't really know how they got the environment and the culture that they do, but they definitely are doing something right. They're my biggest model of how I think things should be. Anyway, all right. Another component is the SDK and the sample app. So we talked about SDK stands for Software Development Kit. API stands for Application Programming Interface. Probably should have defined that a while ago. And the API is language agnostic. Doesn't care what language it's in. But the SDK implements that API in a specific language, like Android, Java, Node, or something. So typically with any kind of API, they develop this language agnostic API, and then they provide SDKs in a couple of target languages, usually JavaScript or Java or something, depending upon your industry, what people use. So what is the technical writer's responsibility to these SDKs? Your responsibility is to document them as well, which usually goes beyond what many of us can do and relies more on engineers. So basically the roles that you play, it depends on how much you know with that language, but you can expect engineers to provide more documentation that you would then edit. And you generally assume that your audience is familiar with that language, so you don't have to explain the basics of the language. You really want to focus on your own API and your company's information, right? Not talking about Ruby or something. Here's an example from Open Weather Map, where they have they have lots of different SDKs or implementations with their API. And you can go through each of these. I think a lot of these are on GitHub and so forth. So this is where actually a lot of APIs or SDKs will live. Yeah, I don't need to go into that. It's not helpful. PayPal has this REST SDK for lots of different things. Heroku, so this is Amazon has a bunch. But this is where the developer docs can quickly get like way over our heads, right? Because of all these different languages. And it's rare that any technical writer would be familiar with so many different languages. So you really have to rely on engineers a lot for this content.
I don't understand what parse SDKs. I mean, is it like you provide code for doing achieving a specific use case? Like,
Yeah, it could be that. It could be that. It's when you implement the API in a particular language, there might be a lot of files that you need in that language. So it's like the implementation in a specific language for the whole API, and it might have sample code for different scenarios. Like, yeah, that would be very, very common. Maybe like a toolkit can provide a smorgasbord of different pieces of code. Think of building.
How is it different from a tutorial?
Oh, well, it's the code itself, whereas the tutorial would be the documentation about how to use it. Like, this is just like, for example, here's all the Java code, then, well, where does it go? How do I install it? What's the steps for running this? That kind of information would be in the docs. This PayPal one, I think, is, if I'm remembering correctly, pretty cool. Maybe it was another one. Anyway, all right, I don't want to spend too much time on the SDK one. Basically, if I have one piece of advice on the SDK one, is that if you do nothing more, try to make it work. If it's a Java thing, make the developer give you a demo and make them execute some command that shows it working. For example, coming back to this Dash example, somebody had an SDK in iOS and Android, and he just sort of delivered these files to me, and I was like, here you are. I was like, okay, what am I supposed to do to make this run? And so we did the walkthrough, had like the Android Studio out where we had a certain virtual machine, and then we ran it, and the VM pops up, and it's like, oh, here are these buttons, and you push this, and it orders something, and you push this, and it configures your settings. That kind of information was just absent. It was like, wouldn't users need to know this? Some basic information about what the SDK does. Is it a sample app? Is it just code samples for like different scenarios? At a very high level, that should be described somewhere. It's really a mixed bag of what it could contain. All right, a couple more. The quick reference. This is again going above and beyond what is normally included, but this could be one-line descriptions of each endpoint. At the gamification company, I made this little quick reference that looked like this. I had to Greek this, but basically it had all these different endpoints, and I tried to make sense of them. Like, these endpoints were related to a certain function, and these related to something else, and so forth. And although I can't remember exactly what the logic was at the time, somehow this was helpful in trying to organize and make sense of it. And you might find that some kind of high-level map like this could be cool. Let's say you have 20 endpoints. What's their hierarchy or relationship to each other? And what do they return and so forth? I pinned this up in my cube, and sort of it was useful at times. It was also just cool to look at. You could also make a quick reference guide that's more traditional. This is a quick reference guide template that I initially made a long time ago, and one of the program managers was so happy he like almost cried because he liked short docs, and I had somehow like captured brevity with this. But people like short things. From a learning paradigm, being able to see the whole picture before you dive into more details is a huge kind of orientation point. If you can't see the whole picture, then the granular level just doesn't make sense. But if you can see this larger picture, then you can take each piece that you find and put it into a larger context. It's really the purpose of a table of contents. Okay, I got too many examples here. Let me punch through this. Best practices is also a good thing to include. This could include a variety of topics. Something about pagination, like, if you just get a list of results and you want to get another page of results, like you only get results 1 through 10, you want to get results 11 through 20, how do you do that? Well, that could be a topic. Time ranges, fault tolerance, anything, SSL versions. So you could have, it really depends on the domain and the API. Okay, got a couple examples here. Let me just point out the last one, the glossary. I'm a big fan of the glossary, but you don't see this too often. When you do, it's pretty exciting. Lyft has a glossary where they define all their terms. Driver rating, look at all these different products. Lyft Line, Lyft Lux SUV, Lyft Plus, Lyft Premier. This would be something that would be a nightmare if you had to sort this out. And by providing a glossary, it can be a huge benefit. Especially in developer docs, I think the glossary is kind of, it's so essential because it's so full of jargon. It needs to be defined. Here's one from Yext. Again, I'm not really sure what the API does, but they've got a lot of different terms that they define here. They decided to break this out into their own one. But I find that defining terms, obviously this applies across products. It's not specific to APIs, but it helps you better it helps you better understand what you're describing and to be more accurate in those descriptions. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Now, okay, I was pushing through that and talking for a long time. Let's do an activity. I know it's 3 o'clock and people are probably getting weary, but let's jump back in here. And if you go to the workshop activities, let me kick something off. Okay, so this is number 6A. Assess the non-reference content in 3 API doc sites. So here's what you'll do. Find, and for the sake of time, why don't we just reduce the scope to 1? But find one API doc project. It could be a project that you have at your work. It could be an open source project. It could be any of the ones from the 100 API doc sites or whatever. But try to identify whether you can find all of these different topics within their documentation. It's a way of sort of evaluating how complete they are. And if you were working on an open source project, it could be a way to identify a gap that you could fill. So I'll give you a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, and then maybe people can share any observations. It's actually quite hard to find where all these things might be, isn't it? Like,
I used to go and just said right.
Look at DocuSign.
Yeah?
Well, not the SDK, no.
which one? Which doc site are you in?
I don't know, I just look at it again because I can't. Basecamp.
Basecamp. Okay.
They don't have SDK that I can tell, but they have most of the others.
Look at DocuSign, theirs is pretty good.
DocuSign?
DocuSign.
On the Basecamp one, isn't theirs on GitHub?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the few, we were talking about this earlier, some people are just like bare bones code. This is their API docs, even for Basecamp, which I think is very design savvy, you know.
But if you look through this, they address, now I'm on a different one, you're on the 3, I'm on the 2.
Oh, okay.
But the Basecamp 2 API, they've got info on just like they have rate limiting.
Hmm.
They have most of the things in your list.
Developers DocuSign is another one. Let me check it out. Yeah, it's a nice looking site.
Yeah, if you drop through a number of them, you get all of, pretty much all the pieces you spoke to.
I mean,
Yeah, they didn't have the last 4, but they have the
Oh.
first 6.
If you go
So,
higher resources and things, and then they also give you code, they drop you right.
Ah, okay.
into that training.
wow, they still have SOAP APIs. Oh,
Yeah.
that's because they're is it a financial thing? Oh yeah, no, it's server certificates, right?
Yeah,
Real estate,
yeah,
everything.
yeah, anything you want to have to sign.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm trying to identify like common patterns, right? So, you know, the degree to which doc sites are going to have all these, sort of my inductive approach to identify what are the essential pieces of good documentation. You know, maybe I've missed it on some, and maybe it's unnecessary, but you know, I think there's merit in a lot of those. All right, any thoughts or questions about non-reference content? It's a really important part of docs. I don't have very many hands-on activities around non-reference content. It seems like I'm not really sure what we can do as an activity beyond just observe and critique existing doc sets.
So when you create an SDK, is there a specific folder structure that we should follow, or would that be application specific?
I think it would be application specific. And it depends what's included in there. There could be like 5 sample apps or chunks of code or just a text file with a big long piece of code or something. It really depends, I think. Yeah. Sorry.
It'd be interesting as an exercise to review different companies' API docs.
Oh, yeah, that would be interesting.
A little more closer to home for
Yeah.
everybody.
All right, now I have a couple sections left in this course. One is on publishing API docs, another on getting a job in API documentation. And the publishing one is pretty near and dear to me because I love working with different tools. But I think I actually have a lot of detail in here that I'm going to skip over a little bit. I don't want, oh, and I have a fun little quotation mark there. But basically, let me jump to some of the high points on this. So excuse me if I'm skipping through some of these. There's a really interesting study. There's not too many like academic articles on API docs, but this one caught my attention. It was published in IEEE actually, and the authors try to figure out why API docs fail. And they conclude that API docs fail due to problems with content. It's like ambiguous content, or it's inconsistent content, or it's like vague or obsolete or outdated. You know, it's not like, oh, it failed because of these simple little things. And they said the main people who could fix a lot of these big content problems are the same engineers who have developed the API. They're not necessarily just the technical writers or people who might not have an in-depth understanding of the product. Maybe that's unfair to characterize the tech writers. But they said, here we go. I thought I had a quote. Anyway, they said the very people who can address these large content issues about how to use the API are often the same engineers who are like strapped for time and bandwidth. So how can we help? Well, as one of the ways that we add value in this API context, this developer doc context, is by facilitating the publishing tools. I mean, we are initially called in to be the publishing specialists. Engineers, I've never worked with an engineer who had any sense of like how to publish API docs or any docs. They're content to hand you a file and then you're the publishing specialist and expert. You figure out how to make it look awesome, right? I'll just supply the content. And that's one way that we add value. If we have a developer hacking away at some code tutorial, well then what's our value? We can make it look professional and publish it in a cool way. At least that's what they were saying. And helping identify where the problems are is another thing. In API docs, I think that you'll find traditional hats aren't often used. Traditional help authoring tools, like, well, I don't want to get into any names, but traditional help authoring tools tend to be used less commonly. This is an example where it is actually used. This is a photo bucket or something. But by and large, you don't see them too often. Why do you think that is? That in developer documentation shops, you don't see a lot of traditional help authoring tools. Flare, RoboHelp, AuthorIt, those kind of tools.
I think that, the point of traditional help authoring tools is to be able to present the help within the context of the application, but the API doc is about other apps that are connecting. It's not about using that application itself.
Okay. Yeah, could be. Anybody else have any thoughts or ideas?
Well, if you're trying to drive it back to the developers to help create the code, it's usually trying to get closer to tools that they're comfortable with using.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the main ones that I've thought as well, or felt as well, right? If you want developers to collaborate, they're going to use their tools. It's just common sense, right? It's like if somebody asked me to collaborate, I would use tools that I'm familiar with. And developers really like to work in their IDEs, their editors, and work at the code level. And they don't want to be bogged down with complex XML formats that maybe they don't really want to learn. So if you look through API doc sites, which you've been doing through this course, you find that there's like a tremendous variety. But how many of those doc sites were identifiable as a help authoring tool output that you saw? Like, they're hard to find. You kind of have to recognize what a tri-pane help authoring tool output looks like, but generally they look like websites, or not they, the sites that have these API docs look like websites rather than a standalone sort of help output, self-contained through something that was created with a hat. We're going to skip this activity because you've been looking at a lot of stuff. But here are some design patterns, common things that you'll see on API doc sites. They have a high level of structure because remember with the REST API reference topic, you've got those common patterns, the sample response, sample request, the methods, parameters, and so forth. They often are represented as a single seamless website, something that matches like the marketing, that's not like separate from the marketing site, but integrates well because they're trying to sell the product, right? The docs are the product, and the product has to look like the company and very well presented. They have a lot of code samples. The pages can be very long. Developers tend to prefer long pages, and they have interactivity in them. So when people set about to do docs in the API doc world, they often adopt this docs as code model, which I feel like has now become pretty commonly understood in the industry. But for how many people is docs as code a new term? Just like a few people. Okay. The idea is that you treat documentation with the same workflow and same approach that you would software code, right? So the developer has some IDE, like some Java editor that they use. They're working in the raw code. They compile it, and then they collaborate with Git and so forth. They push branches and merge branches and all this stuff. Well, you can do the exact same thing with docs, and it's probably the default model in developer documentation is to use a docs as code model. These are the characteristics of docs as code. You have a lightweight markup such as Markdown, could be restructured text, could even be ASCII doc. You have static site generators like Jekyll, Hugo, Sphinx, Go. You have an IDE-like text editor such as Atom Editor or Sublime Text. It's getting kind of hot in here. You have Git. You use Git to manage content, and you build from the server. These last two components are killer features that if you're not already using, are completely game changers. Anyway, so Markdown is the most common syntax, and Markdown is super readable. You know, this is something you pick up in an hour or less, or 5 minutes, whatever. But an asterisk becomes a bullet when it gets rendered. The idea is that you've got very plain text that you don't need any kind of editor to make readable. You don't need, like with XML, it can be hard to read because you've got a lot of tags, and it can be more complex to visualize what's going on. Markdown tries to strip away all that, make it readable, but it's also very simple, right? You're kind of limited. There's a lot of reasons why somebody would choose to use Markdown. Beyond the fact that it's readable as code, it fits really well with Git because it just stores it in a text file. Developers like it because it removes all the complexity from kind of authoring. And it can be flexible because if you find that it's not very adaptable to your situation, you can just switch into HTML, or you can often just use a scripting language to do whatever complex task you're trying to do. All right, I'm going to skip this one. We're going to go to version control, and we are going to do the activities for this one though.
Before you get up.
Yeah.
So this is my problem currently. We're trying to build this fancy site.
Yeah.
But the Markdown that gets interpreted to the HTML doesn't have all the hooks that marketing wants to be able to style it the way they want it to.
What kind of
tools allow you to do? I haven't been able to find yet a way to get into that parsing stage to introduce my interpretation of it.
Yeah. Well, this gets into the controversial part of Markdown that I was hoping to not get sucked into, but basically most programmers who are building publishing tools that rely on Markdown hate Markdown because there's so many flavors of Markdown. You've got cram down Markdown, GitHub flavored Markdown, the original John Gruber Markdown, multi-Markdown, and the list goes on, common Markdown, or common Mark. And when you have such variety, how can you parse it in a predictable way so that like you're using it programmatically? And then, of course, as you say, it's a very primitive syntax. You've got like bullets and numbered lists and headings and links. It's like so you want something styled really cool. It's a lot harder. Well, a couple things. One is you could always just not use Markdown in places where you need more advanced styling. You can just use HTML. So when the parser will look at it, it will just process the HTML. Other Markdown libraries like Cramdown have a little shorthand code for a style tag. So you can put that little style tag in your Markdown, and then it will get applied to the HTML and the output. And then the real method, I didn't really jump into this, define semantics in front matter. But the body content is what stores most of your instructions. But if you have metadata, like what kind of doc type is it and who the audience is or other information, you can store that in these little front matter tags at the top that could then travel with the document. And these front matter tags basically often have like the title, the link. You could have any number of front matter tags that could be used in the processing of the Markdown document. I'll jump into that a little bit more, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. Obviously, XML has a lot more robust publishing capabilities, and so it's you'll probably see Markdown as posing a lot of challenges to that. All right, I want to jump into this Git thing a little more. More than anything, understanding Git specifically, it is the most popular version control system, but this is how developers collaborate with code. And no matter what system you use, you can even use common help authoring tools like Flare and use Git, I believe. So whatever system you use, you will likely collaborate with Git when you're working with developers. Raise your hand if you already use Git, so I get a sense. Wow, like 80% of the people. Great. How do you like using what?
How many like it?
Some people do. Some people are like not so sold on it or not so excited by it. I think well, I'll jump into this a little later. Maybe I'll skip this one then. Should I skip this activity? I was going to have you set up a GitHub wiki and do a simple push and pull. Maybe I'll walk through this real quickly and people can just be like, oh, this is so easy, but it'll give us 5 minutes. Okay. This is activity 7C, all right? GitHub is a great platform for managing your Git projects, right? And every time you create a new repository, if I come over here and just create a new repository, call this Menlo Park, whatever, it's going to include a section that is called Wiki, which is like a sub-repository, some other section within this repository where you could presumably publish a lot of documentation, or not, either way. But you could just come in here and use this as a normal wiki, right? You could say, this is my homepage, hello, whatever. And you could have people edit stuff here. This Basecamp API docs that are on GitHub, it might be simply a collaborative effort like this. But what makes GitHub so unique, and why this isn't really a traditional wiki, is because you can work on it entirely locally, right? So if I wanted to bring this locally, I'm going to copy this clone URL and go into my, let me clear this, go into my terminal, find my directory that I like here, git clone, and now it's taking all this content and it put it in this directory based on the name of this. Change into Menlo Park Wiki. Look in the contents, open home, and suddenly I'm writing hello there from my local machine. Save it. The Git workflow is something you can learn pretty easily from any tutorial online. You know, you've got Git initialized in this directory, and it's kind of it's going to be aware of the files that are there. But if I want Git to start tracking it, I'm going to add all the files that are here. I'm going to check out what files it's that have been modified, that are ready to be committed. I see that home has been modified. It's kind of like on deck, ready to be committed. It's in what's called the staging area. And then when it's good, I add a little commit message. And then I push it back to the server with the push command. Now if I come back into my repo and I refresh the page, you can see that it's got the change, right? So this is how most people in the development world live and breathe for how they work on their code. The typical workflow is that you will, if you ever work with a developer's code, you will work in a branch, make changes in a branch. When you're done, create a pull request to merge it back into the main branch or some other merge request, and the developer would merge it back in and push it live. Or maybe your docs are just separate. They don't have developers involved in the workflow, but you have other writers pushing and pulling. So was that command where I did the push and the pull pretty common and very familiar to people, or was this like, what is he doing? How do you use Git in your workflows? Does anybody want to share or elaborate?
It's a pretty dumb source control system. The way we use it is just a place to stash files, and we don't share the repo with anyone else. It's just for us. So.
Yeah. Okay. So you use it to collaborate within just the writers, and they interact there. Anybody else? Mark?
So we use it for all of our documentation right now. We're in Git. We
Oh.
Files in Git. We use
Oh.
clips to push and pull. And
Nice.
clone and do all that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anytime you have just text files, they make it super compatible with Git, and Dita certainly qualifies for that, even though it might not be classified usually in the static site generator type of domain. Oxygen is essentially the same thing. Builds out these outputs. Anybody else? Yes, in the back.
My files are actually on the build, software build.
On what?
In the build.
Oh, okay.
Build, so, and so I go through the developer process of reviews, code reviews, and checking in and pushing at each release.
Oh, so you have a formal workflow for going in and actually working with the same source as the developers.
Yeah.
And do you make edits in a branch and then they merge it? How do they?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. So I just have my local repository, make the edits, and then I commit, and then I push.
Okay.
Yeah, with the developers. So I have to run the test Jenkins and all that stuff.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah, it's really good.
We have. Well, I was going to get into this later, but I think I'll just speak to it at a high level. We have. Let's see, where are we? We just did those three. Yeah, we have a Jekyll setup where I'm at. Actually, we previously had a CMS, and we ripped it out and put in a Jekyll setup. And the cool part about it is that we had engineers build a publishing pipeline. So we tap into the existing Git infrastructure that the developers are already using. So we didn't have to use GitHub because everything's internal. And we just adopt similar workflows as developers or anybody using Git. But then when you push changes to a certain branch, it can kick off a publishing workflow on the server. And that is really the killer feature of documentation. Here's an example. This is, all my course stuff is in Jekyll. And here I've got at the top my front matter tags. This is the workshop activities page. And I've got like a title, a permalink, and I have a bunch of extra stuff I've used that that I'm making use of in the templates for publishing and so forth. But if I wanted to add something here, hello from Menlo Park, whatever. I like Atom because it has this little built-in terminal editor. This is a package or something I added, terminal something. I can check to see what changes I've made. I've only modified this document. You know, this is how we work in the App Store. Like all the different teams that are using this, my team and 2 other teams have similar workflows where they're all getting the information. So first I would add this change, small change, whatever. I would pull to see if any changes have been made by others, right? Since I'm the only one in my repo, I never get that. But as soon as I push into this master branch on the server, if I were to go into GitHub, where this is managed, there's a tool called GitHub Pages. If I look at a repository, there we go. And I believe, there's a security vulnerability. I need to fix that. Okay. I thought it would show me that it's building at some point. I thought there was like a green circle. Oh, there we go. It already built it. This would be, see, it just built my site and made that update in that 44 seconds, small change. But while it was building, it would just be like a green dot or a yellow dot or something. And if I come back in here to my workshop activities page and refresh, you can see that it shows the change. So now I've offloaded all the local processing, the compilation and whatever build process that would normally take place locally, which I could do with Jekyll. If I bundle exec Jekyll serve is their command, and it will build it. But the fact that you can get the server to do that then removes this huge toll, and you can make all kinds of small little changes, sweeping changes across a lot of different files. You push it to the server, it builds it, you're done. And that has saved so much time. See, here's the local URL where I could see if I like the change and so forth locally. But it saves so much time, and it is really the killer feature of the Doxys code. See here, this local version. Anyway, the tooling it depends on your context, and you may be in a place that has much grander needs that aren't served through this sort of Doxys code category of tools. Certainly could be the case. But if you can configure builds from the server, which I know you can now do with Flare and their hub server, central hub, mad hub, whatever it is, it's starting to become a more common paradigm. You don't have to publish files locally, then transmit them through an FTP server somewhere, or otherwise move them. In the front, yes?
Yeah, we also use GitHub to collect user feedback, user comments.
Oh, yeah.
We also use GitHub feature or issues to track user feedback, and when the issue is resolved or responded to, then the person providing the feedback gets to see it through the GitHub issue number. Yeah,
that is a great thing to call out. Yeah, I mean, I don't have GitHub open anymore, but definitely I think people appreciate that ability to kind of track and see what happens with their requests. So, in the back.
What do you think of PDFs?
So I was just, let me go to my docs site at work. We have our docs on developer.amazon.com, and if I go to any page, I do like PDFs as a review tool. So if I come into FireTF, for example, and I want somebody to review it, I could just print it. It has a printable view that strips out the header and the sidebar, save it, and then they open it up in Acrobat and can make comments galore. So as part of a review process, I think it can be pretty nifty. But as far as like packaging it as a standard deliverable on the website, some people really like it. I think a lot of people don't do it in part because the Docs as Code tools don't really push it out by default, except for maybe Sphinx. What do you think of PDF? No, you don't have any strong opinions?
We're doing it. I'm not sure if it's just because it's what we've always been doing. I hear rumors that it's sort of like outdated. But from a proprietary perspective, I don't know if a company would allow people to just go ahead and print it.
Yeah, you're gonna get a lot of friction.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
The problem is that Google won't search inside PDFs. And people want to find your info by searching on Google. That's the main reason it's not
It can't be the only tool.
Right, it's fine to have it, but not as the only one.
But also too, there's some environments where you can't get to the internet, right? They're locked down. If you go into network hubs, you can't get to the outside world, so you have to have some other way for them to be able to access your documents. And whether it's they download your HTML files and do, a local server or you do PDFs. So there's some environments you just can't do.
Well, and then I have a customer that the only thing they produce is PDFs and their doc is nowhere on the web because they manufacture ATMs. They don't want anyone knowing the internal workings.
Yeah.
So it's only a PDF. It's delivered printed with the machine.
Yeah.
Nobody even gets the file.
Yeah, there are all kinds of use cases that support PDF, so definitely they're naming them. The drawback, I think, is that it's more cumbersome to keep updated. You saw that I just made that little update, and now if I had a PDF, it wouldn't contain this update. So it's like it's more involved, and then styling it. But I do have like a whole PDF process that I configured with Jekyll that uses prints XML, which I really like because it lets you. I think it's just called prints. Anyway, it lets you style the PDF with CSS, which I think is pretty cool. Like normally you'd have to use the XSLT kind of transform language, but this makes it a lot easier. So you can marry the PDF generation with the Docs as Code tools and there are other ways to generate PDF. It requires more skill. Like to create a PDF that looks good is hard, no matter what tool you use. And but yeah, I think people might like subsets of information. And if a PDF can distill everything you need into 20 pages instead of requiring somebody to sort through 200, then great. But okay, any other thoughts about publishing docs? Yes.
Do you have to have this hosted somewhere? So if you do GitHub and you do GitHub pages and you go through the magical publishing process, do people just, like if I have my own URL, do they just hit it? Or do you also have to have it hosted somewhere so that the people can, do they go to GitHub? Does it, do all your requests go to GitHub? Or, maybe that's a stupid
No. So this site right here, my site, I'd rather be writing whatever. It is hosted on GitHub Pages, but it incorporates a C name so that it doesn't have their domain. It's a simple thing if you just Google it, but you have to.
Paying hosting fees.
No, you have to own the domain, and you pay the domain fee of $15 a year or whatever for the domain, and you configure that as a C name in GitHub Pages, and you get free hosting. They say they have a 1 gigabyte limit, but my site's 2 gigs, and I have not gotten any complaints. And you can break it up into multiple repos. This Learn API doc is its own repo. My blog is its own repo. It's a pretty killer deal, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's
static.
Yeah.
Just thinking of it for a project portfolio for someone
Yeah.
who started, it's like people could go.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I also have like Cloudflare in there, but it's not really necessary. They claim it makes it faster, but I haven't noticed.
It's all static content for you. You don't have
Yeah.
a bunch of script and back-end stuff.
No, there's no database. There's no database component, which is also another limitation because some people like things to be more dynamic. Like they want to have like the ability to filter on the fly. Other static site generators might be better at that, like Gatsby, which is built on React. It's very popular, but it's not integrated into GitHub Pages. GitHub Pages has some kind of special relationship with Jekyll, in part because the co-founder of GitHub, Tom Preston Werner, also made Jekyll, I think. But it's also just easier. Like Jekyll is easy. It's less error prone. All right, I have one more section. We're only planning to go till about 4, and then we would kick it over to like kind of individual consultations, chats, and so forth. This last section, I told you I just sort of added it, speaks to some of the other challenges in this field. Before we get into this, any other questions about Docs as code or publishing tools or other concerns? Yes?
Just real quickly, can you talk about Swagger integration within GitHub? Like how it's done, where it's published through?
It's not really, like Swagger would not be easy to integrate into GitHub. Basically, you would just link to an output. You could, like let's say you had the Swagger UI project that is its own collection of static files. You could put that in a GitHub repository and then publish it on GitHub, sure. Yeah, so sorry, I guess I misinterpreted that. I thought you meant like if you had a basic wiki page on GitHub, you can't like embed, well maybe you could if you had the right template. Yeah, in short, you could display and store your Swagger UI in a GitHub repo just fine, yeah. In fact, that's what I have here in this course, Swagger demo, UI demo. All these files are right within, this is Swagger UI embedded in a page. I just basically copied and pasted it in there, all their code. And then as a standalone file, and all this is being read from the GitHub repo. Yeah, all right, so maybe I shouldn't have titled this Getting a Job. Maybe it's more like, excelling. But if you want to kind of move forward in developer docs, you really need some technical familiarity and some writing samples that demonstrate that. Some kind of portfolio with developer documentation. And a lot of positions will say, we want you to be able to read in one or more programming languages, such as Java, C++, or Python. I swear they copy the same phrase into every job posting. And yet, when you work in developer docs, you may find that this is completely not the case, that you don't need this at all. Why is it so common? Well, what most employers want is a sense of technical acuity. And the idea is that if you are technical enough to read languages in one of these programming languages, or read code in that language, then you've got the technical mentality and aptitude to learn their tools or their technology needs. So in that way, it doesn't entirely matter what you set yourself to learning. As long as you kind of become a specialist in that, it will inform and infuse your mind with this technical aptitude that will give you the ability to thrive in that area. But even so, there is some practical need, right? I showed this earlier where you have an API that's language agnostic, but then you have SDKs that are language specific. And there are lots of commonalities from one to another, and it helps to have familiarity with that in order to excel. I mean, if you can't read code, you will be limited in what you can do. You'll be limited to like editing and publishing and not so much content development. Or you will be limited to just interviewing engineers and kind of writing up notes, which might be all that can be expected in many scenarios. This was the quote I was hunting for earlier. This is from that same study where they say the biggest problems with API docs were also the ones requiring the most technical expertise to solve. Completing, clarifying, and correcting documentation required deep authoritative knowledge of the API's implementation. And this makes accomplishing these tasks difficult for non-developers or recent contributors to a project. In other words, if you really want to make your API docs awesome, you have to marry this kind of rhetorical ability with language with this technical awareness and knowledge and familiarity. And that is why, you know, it's such a difficult field, because you have to be a developer and a writer at the same time and marry the two skill sets. It requires a constant learning, a constant challenge. It's very rare that somebody has deep technical knowledge while also having deep writing skills to, you know, manage dozens, hundreds of pages and, you know, structure them and, you know, make them flow and also have them be very technically accurate. So this question is, well, what is the ideal hybrid? Do you want a writer who has learned programming, a programmer who has learned writing? These are debates that I have with my colleague, and we flip both ways. Because I'm from a humanities background, I think people underestimate the writing skills, and he's from a tech background, and he's like, I just want them to be technical, you know. And so, however it is, it boils down to the very kind of job title, technical writer. You have to be technical and you have to have writing skills. And the more technical and the more writing skills you have that you bring together, the more powerful of a candidate and kind of job person you are in this market. There's a quote from this presentation that Andrew Davis, who is one of the top like API doc recruiters in this area, had with one of his contractors about like this level of technical expertise. So let me just, it's just going to play through my own, and I don't have that set up. Let me see how loud it can sound. Oh,
the engineers were very
I don't
surprised
get anything. I'll skip it. Let me summarize it. Basically, this guy James Neiman, they say James, how much like technical familiarity do you need to excel in API docs? Now, granted, they're trying to get people in Europe, in this case, to hire Andrew Davis to farm out like API doc specialists. But James says that he thinks you really need a strong like engineering background in order to excel. I think he overstates it. Some other people push back and say, you know, when you dive into the technical realm, you are going to be sacrificing many other things. You're no longer looking at content more closely, and your web analytics and your user feedback and all these other elements will sort of become put to pasture because you're sinking so much time just learning the technical details. Well, it's definitely a challenge, right? Trying to figure out how you stay apt technically while also managing, you know, 7 different projects and doing umpteen writing tasks. This is a quote by somebody who pushed back on this. He says, the need for writers to have deep technical knowledge diminishes as these tech teams grow in size and other skills become more important. He says, I'm not claiming that deep technical knowledge is useless. I'm suggesting that neglecting deep technical knowledge has less severe consequences than neglecting content creation, doc toolset, or workflow considerations. So it's kind of like you can't have it all, right? If you want to sink time into becoming a technical expert, it means you probably won't be a doc tool expert or have like other sort of aspects attended to in the documentation. Here's how I sort of reconcile it with different projects. I think our involvement in developer documentation falls along a spectrum. And you can do 3 things. So you can do, if you have strong technical knowledge, then you can do authoring, publishing, and editing. You can do it all. If you have weak technical knowledge, you might only be able to like publish something for somebody. And if you're kind of in the middle, you can probably do some editing and publishing. So, you know, it's not as if like your level of involvement is an either or. It's more of a continuum, right? And the more tech you know, the more you can do. But if you don't know, you can still do many other tasks. And if you have a wide variety of projects, you know, you might be publishing for one only, but for the other, you might be playing more authoring roles as well. And that is really the reality of it. You might just play different roles with different types of tech on different projects. All right, I have a few other slides here, but I'm going to skip over them. Even have one, should you move to California? Everybody's in California. Tourism. This is the only picture I had that I had actually taken that I felt I could easily use, although I don't know who they are. But there's this idea that, like, you know, California is where all the big developer doc jobs are, but it's this terrible sacrifice of, like, you can never buy a house and you have terrible congestion, and, you know, is it worth it? Or is this where all the jobs are in developer documentation? If you move to Florida, are there even opportunities? Well, I did a survey. I tried to figure out where are the developer doc jobs. California, Texas, New York, DC, Washington, Virginia, Massachusetts, Illinois, and Georgia seem to have the most instances of API, as well as the highest number of technical writers. So by inference,
there's a bunch in Denver.
Yeah, it was probably number 12 on this list. Who knows? But yeah. Anyway, this is where being a research scientist would be handy, because then they could, you know, actually show me the proper way to do this. All right, that's pretty much it. Any final questions or thoughts?
Yeah, could I just ask?
Yeah.
Sorry if I missed this at the beginning, being late, but so what percentage of your job is developer documentation?
I would say probably 95%. But I have got myself into a scenario where all the APIs, or at least most of them, are Android APIs, because Amazon's platform is based on Android, which is its own. It's got its own API world. It's kind of like Java. It's got its own built-in libraries. So half of my job is like pointing people into Google's API documentation of Android and explaining how to use those on Amazon. Anyway, it's interesting. I do have a survey I'm hoping you to take. Can you refresh the page on the same workshop activities one, under part 1, workshop activities? And if you go down to the very bottom, there should be a new section that says survey. I just kind of push it out there. I'm trying to get some feedback here. So this will take you like a few minutes. How would you rate the workshop? Which sections did you find most relevant? How would you rate the workshop activities? Did I get all your questions answered? This is completely anonymous, but it'll help me. And then some other feedback. So take a few minutes, and then after this, I'm making myself available till 5 to just chat with you one-on-one about anything that you want. So the order will just be, I guess I'll have people sign up their names afterwards. But go ahead and do the survey.